I still remember the sting of winter air on my cheeks, the way the porch light flickered behind the frosted glass, and how my brother's laughter echoed through the door he'd just locked behind me. I was 10, shivering in my pajamas, watching my own family pretend I didn't exist. That was the first time I realized you could be surrounded by people and still feel completely invisible. Years later, a single cruel prank would change everything, leaving me paralyzed and turning my family from silent bystanders into something far worse. If you've ever felt unseen or unheard by the people who should have loved you most, you're not alone. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, it would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Madison Carter, and I grew up in a house where silence was the loudest sound. From the outside, our home in upstate New York looked like a picture from a real estate magazine white siding, a red maple tree that blazed every autumn, a porch swing that creaked in the wind. My father, Richard, was a partner at a law firm, always in a suit, always with a plan. My mother, Susan, ran the PTA, organized charity drives, and made sure our family Christmas cards were sent out before Thanksgiving. My older brother, Ethan, was the golden boy captain of the soccer team, straight-A student, the kind of son who made other parents jealous. And then there was me, Madison, the quiet one, the sensitive one, the one who always seemed to be in the way. I learned early that in our family, being noticed was dangerous. When I was 10, I spilled a glass of milk at dinner. My mother's lips tightened, and Ethan snickered. My father didn't say a word, just pointed to the back door. I stood outside on the porch in my pajamas, the cold biting through the thin cotton, while Ethan watched from the window, his breath fogging the glass. I remember the porch light flickering, the way my mother pulled the curtains closed, pretending not to see me shivering. That was the first time I realized that in my family, pain was something to be hidden, not healed. Ethan was always the center of attention. When he broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, my parents paid for the repairs and told everyone it was an accident. When I got a B in math, my father sat me down and told me I needed to work harder if I wanted to be half as successful as your brother. At my 16th birthday party, Ethan received a brand new car, complete with a giant red bow, while I unwrapped a self-help book called How to Be Less Sensitive. My mother smiled as she handed it to me, her voice soft but sharp. This will help you toughen up. Maddie, the world isn't kind to girls who cry. I learned to keep my head down, to swallow my feelings, to disappear into the background. I spent hours in my room, drawing or reading, anything to avoid the constant comparisons and the feeling that I was always falling short. My father's approval was a currency I could never earn, and my mother's affection was reserved for moments when no one else was watching. Ethan, meanwhile, basked in the glow of their attention, his every achievement celebrated, his every mistake excused. By the time I left for college, I had built walls around myself so high that even I couldn't see over them. I chose a university 3 states away, majoring in art education, and for the first time, I felt a sense of freedom. I made friends who liked me for who I was, not for who I was supposed to be. I started therapy, slowly untangling the knots my family had tied inside me. I visited home only for holidays, each time bracing myself for the familiar sting of being overlooked. After graduation, I moved to Albany and began teaching at an elementary school. I rented a small apartment with creaky floors and a view of the city skyline. I filled it with plants and paintings, creating a space that felt like mine. I called my parents once a week, out of obligation more than desire, and saw them only when I couldn't avoid it. Ethan, now working in finance in Manhattan, rarely called at all, except to boast about his latest promotion or to ask for a favor. For a while, I thought I'd escaped the gravity of my family. But family, I would learn, has a way of pulling you back in no matter how far you run. It was a gray afternoon in early March when my mother called, her voice tight with urgency. "Maddie, you need to come home this weekend. We're throwing a party for Ethan's 30th birthday. Your father and I expect you to be there." I hesitated, searching for an excuse, but she cut me off. "Don't disappoint us. Ethan's friends are coming in from the city. It would mean a lot to him if you showed up." I knew it wasn't about Ethan. It was about appearances, about keeping up the image of the perfect family. Still, I agreed, the old guilt settling in my chest like a stone. I spent the drive home rehearsing the boundaries my therapist had helped me set. I would stay at a hotel, not at the house. I would leave if things got uncomfortable. I would not let them pull me back into old patterns. But as I pulled into the driveway, the familiar ache returned. The house looked the same as it always had, but I felt like a stranger. Inside, the party was already in full swing. The living room was filled with Ethan's friends loud. Confident men in expensive suits, their laughter echoing off the walls. My mother greeted me with a quick hug and a once-over, her eyes lingering on my jeans and sweater. "You look comfortable," she said, her tone neutral. My father barely glanced up from the grill, where he was flipping steaks with military precision. Ethan spotted me from across the room and strode over, his arm slung around the shoulders of his best friend, Tyler. "Look who finally decided to show up," he said, grinning. "Did you get lost on the way?" "Maddie." His friends laughed, and I forced a smile, feeling the old humiliation rise in my throat. I handed Ethan a card with a gift certificate inside, and he barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the pile of presents. "Thanks, sis," he said, already turning back to his friends. I wandered through the house, trying to blend in, but everywhere I went, I felt out of place. The conversation swirled around me, but no one seemed to notice I was there. After dinner, Ethan and his friends gathered in the backyard for drinks. My mother insisted I join them, her hand tight on my arm as she steered me outside. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last light of day. Ethan proposed a game of truth or dare, and before I could protest, I was pulled into the circle. "Okay, Maddie," Ethan said, his eyes glinting. Truth or dare, I hesitated. But the group was already chanting, "Truth, truth." Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "Tell everyone the most embarrassing thing you've ever done." I felt my cheeks burn as I remembered the night I wet the bed at a sleepover in 3rd grade. A story Ethan had never let me forget. I tried to laugh it off, but the group erupted in laughter, and I felt the old shame settle over me like a blanket. I excused myself. Slipping back into the house, I found my mother in the kitchen, arranging cupcakes on a tray. "You're not leaving already?" "Are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan would be so disappointed. I shook my head, unable to speak. I just needed a moment to breathe. Later that night, as the party wound down, I decided to leave. I gathered my things and headed for the back door, hoping to slip away unnoticed. As I stepped onto the porch, I felt my foot slide out from under me. The world tilted, and I crashed down hard onto the concrete steps. Pain shot through my back, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I couldn't feel anything below my waist. I called out for help, my voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face twisted in annoyance. "Get up! Maddie, stop being so dramatic." I tried to explain, but he just rolled his eyes and disappeared back inside. Minutes passed. The cold seeped into my bones, and I began to shiver. My mother finally appeared, her face pinched with irritation. "What are you doing out here?" she hissed. "You're making a scene." I told her I couldn't move, that something was wrong, but she just shook her head. "You're always looking for attention. Just get up and come inside." I lay there, helpless, as the party continued inside. I could hear laughter and music, the clink of glasses, the sound of my family pretending everything was fine. I tried to drag myself up the steps, but my body refused to cooperate. Tears stung my eyes, but I bit my lip, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. It was Tyler, of all people, who finally noticed something was wrong. He stepped outside to smoke and found me sprawled on the steps, my face pale and my breathing shallow. He knelt beside me, his voice suddenly serious. "Maddie, can you move your legs?" I shook my head, and he cursed under his breath. He called for help, and soon the backyard was filled with people, their faces a blur of concern and confusion. An ambulance arrived, lights flashing in the darkness. The paramedics worked quickly, strapping me to a backboard and loading me into the ambulance. My mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands, while my father argued with the paramedics about whether it was really necessary to take me to the hospital. Ethan stood off to the side, his face unreadable. At the hospital, the doctors ordered a battery of tests. I lay in a sterile room, the ceiling tiles spinning above me as they wheeled me into the MRI machine. The noise was deafening, but all I could think about was the numbness in my legs, the fear that I might never walk again. When the results came back, the news was worse than I could have imagined. I had suffered a severe spinal cord injury, the kind that changes everything. The doctors explained that I might regain some movement with time and therapy, but there were no guarantees. My world shrank to the size of a hospital bed, my future suddenly uncertain. The police arrived the next morning, asking questions about the accident. Tyler told them he had seen Ethan pouring something on the steps earlier in the evening, laughing with his friends about how Maddie always falls for the oldest tricks. The officers collected evidence, including a bottle of motor oil found near the porch. My parents insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that Ethan would never do something so reckless. But the facts spoke for themselves. In the days that followed, my family's facade began to crack. My father hired a lawyer, insisting that the whole thing was an accident. My mother stopped visiting, claiming she was too busy managing the fallout. Ethan was arrested and charged with reckless endangerment. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. I spent weeks in the hospital, learning to navigate a world that no longer made sense. Physical therapy was grueling, each session a reminder of what I had lost. I learned to move from my bed to a wheelchair, to dress myself, to adapt to a body that no longer obeyed my commands. The nurses were kind, their encouragement a lifeline in the darkness. My friends from work visited, bringing flowers and cards, their presence a balm to my wounded spirit. My parents called occasionally, their conversations stilted and awkward. They never apologized, never acknowledged the role they had played in my injury. Ethan wrote me a letter from jail, filled with excuses and half-hearted apologies. I read it once and threw it away. As the weeks turned into months, I began to rebuild my life. I moved into an accessible apartment, outfitted with ramps and grab bars. I returned to teaching, this time working with children who had special needs. I found purpose in helping others navigate challenges of their own, my own experience giving me a new sense of empathy. I joined a support group for survivors of family trauma, where I met people who understood what it meant to be betrayed by those you loved. We shared our stories, our pain, our hope for something better. Slowly, I began to heal not just physically, but emotionally. I learned to forgive myself for the things I could not change. The legal case dragged on for nearly a year. My parents' lawyer argued that they had done everything they could, that I was prone to exaggeration, that Ethan's prank was just a harmless joke gone wrong. But the evidence was clear, and the jury saw through their lies. Ethan was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. My parents were found guilty of neglect and ordered to pay restitution for my medical expenses. I never returned to the house where I grew up. I cut off contact with my family, choosing instead to surround myself with people who valued and respected me. I built a new family from friends, colleagues, and fellow survivors. Together, we celebrated birthdays, holidays, and the small victories that made life worth living. There were days when the pain was overwhelming, when I missed the life I had lost. But there were also moments of joy watching a student take their first steps with a walker, sharing a meal with friends, feeling the sun on my face as I wheeled through the park. I learned that happiness was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something I had to find for myself. 2 years after the accident, I received a letter from Ethan. He had completed his sentence and was living in another state, working at a car dealership. He wrote that he was sorry for what he had done, that he was in therapy, that he hoped one day I could forgive him. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, unsure if I would ever respond. My parents moved to Florida, selling the house and starting over in a new community. I heard through mutual friends that they told people I had been injured in a tragic accident, never mentioning the truth. I no longer cared. Their version of events no longer had power over me. I continued to work, to volunteer, to advocate for people with disabilities. I spoke at conferences, sharing my story in the hope that it might help others feel less alone. I met a man named Daniel, a physical therapist with a gentle smile and a kind heart. We became friends, then something more. He saw me not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman with strength and resilience. On the anniversary of my injury, I sat in the park with Daniel and a group of friends, watching the sun set over the city. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who stood shivering on the porch, waiting for someone to notice her. I thought about the woman I had become, the one who no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. After that first anniversary, life didn't suddenly become easy, but it did become more honest. I started to see the world and myself through a different lens. I was no longer the girl who waited for her family to notice her pain. I was a woman who had survived the worst kind of betrayal and was still standing, even if I now did so with the help of a wheelchair. My days settled into a new rhythm. I woke up early, sunlight filtering through the curtains of my apartment, and made coffee in the kitchen I had designed for accessibility. I learned to appreciate the small victories transferring from my bed to my chair without help, reaching the top shelf with a grabber, wheeling myself to the park on a crisp autumn morning. Each task was a reminder that I was still capable, still independent, even if my body had changed. At school, I became a resource for other teachers and students facing challenges. I started a lunchtime art club for kids who felt like outsiders, the ones who ate alone or struggled to fit in. We painted, sculpted, and sometimes just talked. I saw myself in their quiet resilience, their longing to be seen. One afternoon, a girl named Lily stayed behind after everyone else had left. She hesitated at the door, then turned to me and whispered, "Thank you for making a place for people like me." Her words stayed with me for weeks. Outside of work, I continued therapy, digging deeper into the wounds my family had left behind. My therapist, Dr. Patel, was patient and unflinching. She never let me hide behind humor or deflection. You don't have to forgive them to move on. She told me one rainy afternoon, "You just have to stop letting their voices drown out your own." I wrote those words on a sticky note and placed it on my bathroom mirror, reading it every morning as I brushed my teeth. Daniel and I grew closer, our friendship blossoming into something gentle and steady. He never pitied me, never treated me as fragile. He listened when I needed to talk, sat with me in silence when I didn't. On weekends, we explored the city together, museums, farmers markets, outdoor concerts. He pushed my chair when the sidewalks were rough, but always asked first. With him, I felt seen in a way I never had before. One evening, as we watched a thunderstorm roll in from my balcony, Daniel asked if I ever thought about reconnecting with my family. I was quiet for a long time, listening to the rain tapping against the glass. Sometimes, I admitted, but I don't know if I want to open that door again. I'm not sure there's anything left on the other side." He nodded, understanding that some wounds never fully close. The legal aftermath of my injury continued to ripple through my life. The settlement from my parents' insurance helped cover my medical bills and allowed me to modify my apartment, but it couldn't erase the memories. Occasionally, I received updates from my lawyer about the status of the trust fund or the finalization of the civil case. Each letter was a reminder of everything I had lost and everything I had survived. I found unexpected comfort in the community of people with disabilities I met through advocacy work. We shared stories of frustration and triumph, of navigating a world that wasn't built for us. I learned how to advocate for myself at the doctor's office, at work, in public spaces. I joined a local group that lobbied for better accessibility in city buildings and public transportation. For the first time, I felt like my voice mattered. One spring, I was invited to speak at a conference on trauma and resilience. Standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, I felt a surge of nerves. But as I began to tell my story, the words came easily. I spoke about the night of the accident, the months of recovery, the pain of being dismissed by my own family. I talked about the power of chosen family, about finding strength in vulnerability. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. Afterwards, people approached me with tears in their eyes, thanking me for sharing what they had never been able to say out loud. That summer, I received another letter from Ethan. This one was different, longer, more reflective. He wrote about his time in prison, the therapy he was undergoing, the ways he was trying to change. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only for understanding. He wrote, "I know I can never undo what I did, but I want you to know I'm trying to be better. I hope you find peace, even if it's without me." I read the letter several times, feeling a complicated mix of anger, sadness, and relief. I didn't write back, but I didn't throw it away either. My parents remained silent. I heard through distant relatives that they had joined a new church in Florida, that my mother volunteered at a food bank, that my father played golf every weekend. They never reached out, never acknowledged what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if they ever thought about me, if they ever regretted the choices they had made. But those thoughts grew less frequent as time went on. As the years passed, my life expanded in ways I never expected. I completed a master's degree in special education, focusing my research on trauma-informed teaching, and I published articles, led workshops, and mentored new teachers. My work became a way to transform my pain into purpose, to help others find hope in the aftermath of loss. Daniel and I moved in together, choosing a ground floor apartment with wide doorways and a small garden out back. We adopted a rescue dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Max, who quickly became the center of our little family. On weekends, we took Max to the park, where he chased squirrels and made friends with every child he met, watching him run. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. One autumn afternoon, I received an invitation to my high school's 20th reunion. At first, I laughed and tossed it aside, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to go, more for myself than for anyone else. Daniel came with me, his hand steady on my shoulder as we entered the gymnasium, now decorated with streamers and old yearbook photos. I saw faces I hadn't thought about in years, classmates who had barely noticed me, teachers who had favored Ethan. Some people stared at my wheelchair, others greeted me warmly. I found myself in a conversation with Mrs. Reynolds, my old art teacher. She remembered my drawings, the way I used to stay after class to finish projects. "You always had something special." "Madison," she said, her eyes kind. "I'm glad to see you found your way." The reunion was a strange mix of nostalgia and closure. I realized that I no longer needed anyone's approval, not my classmates, not my family's. I had built a life that was mine, shaped by both pain and perseverance. That winter, I was asked to join the board of a nonprofit that provided scholarships for students with disabilities. The work was challenging but rewarding. And I found joy in helping others access opportunities that had once seemed out of reach. I mentored a young woman named Brianna, who had been paralyzed in a car accident. We met for coffee every week, talking about everything from accessibility to dating to the frustrations of dealing with insurance companies. Watching her grow in confidence, I saw echoes of my own journey. On the 3rd anniversary of my injury, I organized a small gathering in my apartment. Daniel, Max, a handful of close friends, and a few colleagues filled the rooms with laughter and warmth. We toasted to survival, to new beginnings, to the families we choose. As the evening wound down, I sat by the window, watching snow fall softly outside. I thought about the girl I had been, the woman I had become, and the future that still stretched before me. Sometimes, I still dreamed about my family. In those dreams, I was always trying to reach them, calling out for help, but my voice was lost in the wind. I would wake up with a heavy heart, but the feeling faded quickly, replaced by gratitude for the life I had built. One spring morning, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. It was my mother. Her voice was hesitant, almost fragile. She told me she had seen an article about my work in a national magazine, that she was proud of me. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Madison, for everything." I listened, unsure how to respond. The apology was years too late, but it was something. I told her I was doing well, that I hoped she was too. We ended the call with polite goodbyes, neither of us promising to call again. Afterwards, I sat in the garden with Max, feeling a strange sense of release. I realized I no longer needed anything from my parents, not their approval, not their love, not even their apology. I had found those things elsewhere, in the people who had shown up for me when it mattered most. As the years went by, I continued to grow, to heal, to find meaning in the life I had created. I traveled with Daniel, visiting cities I had only read about. We explored museums in Chicago, gardens in Portland, beaches in Maine. Each trip was an adventure, a reminder that the world was still full of beauty and possibility. I kept in touch with Brianna, who graduated college and started her own nonprofit. We spoke at conferences together, sharing our stories and encouraging others to find their own strength. I watched as she inspired a new generation of advocates, her voice clear and unwavering. On the 5th anniversary of my injury, I stood braced between parallel bars, my legs trembling but strong enough to bear my weight for a few moments. Daniel stood beside me, his eyes shining with pride. I took a shaky step, then another, the room erupting in cheers. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. I had come farther than I ever thought possible. Looking back, I see my life as a tapestry woven from both pain and hope. The threads of betrayal and loss are there, but so are the threads of resilience, love, and new beginnings. I am not defined by what happened to me, but by how I chose to move forward. If you're listening to my story and see yourself in these words, know that you are not alone. Healing is not linear, and forgiveness is not always necessary. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to live, to love, and to hope again. Thank you for being here, for witnessing my journey. I hope you find your own path to peace, whatever that may look like. And remember, you are worthy of love, just as you are.